All right. What's up, everybody? I am here with Dr. Larsen, and today we're going to be talking about something I rarely talk about on this channel because I'm always talking about like meta ethics and stuff. We're going to be talking about psychopathy and, the question of whether or not it's even a real construct. So you'll see some parallels towards with some of the things I talk about. So I'm here with Dr. Larsen. Why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a bit about who you are, what we're doing, set the stage for us.
Yeah, hi Lance. Thanks for having me. My name is Rasmus. I'm a assistant professor at the University of Toronto. I'm a forensic epistemologist. So what really gets me going and what I'm interested in is how we apply science in the legal system to enhance and optimize decision making. Specifically, I have taken an interest in psychopathy research and how that research has been applied in the legal system to make decisions about justice-involved individuals.
All right. And so what prompted the discussion is I came across an article from you, and basically what I wanted to do is ask you, basically do a rundown of what's in that article and then throw some questions at you that maybe aren't fully addressed there, although it's a pretty chunky article, which I thought had had a lot of stuff in it. And I'll put a link to that article in the description for this video so you could go check it out. But I guess the first way, the way to get started naturally, is to just say, like, what is psychopathy? There's this popular conception of psychopathy, but maybe you could lay out for us what psychopathy is supposed to be from a psychological or clinical perspective, and then perhaps how that relates to the popular conception.
Yeah, so psychopathy or psychopathic personality disorder or a psychopath, there's probably all terms that some of the listeners have heard before. There is, of course, a couple of clear distinctions we got to make first. Is that when ordinary folks, so non-scientists or non-clinicians, say a psychopath or a psychopathy, they might have something different in mind compared to when a scientist used the term, in the sense that when a scientist use the term, they refer to specifically to a personality disorder or a type of diagnosis, if you will, that you can give to a person. And this is usually implied that we're talking about an individual who has some sort of very grave impulse control problems. They might have very shallow or even non-existing emotions. They have problems with remorse and empathy, and altogether a very antisocially disposed individual who might not be your favorite person to run into, right? So in other words, also a very dangerous individual who do not really have any regards for the social fabric and the moral laws that seems to guide other people's choices. So this is the conceptual description. So you have to imagine an individual who kind of comes across in all those ways, right? So we have seen this, of course, portrayed in popular culture, such as movies and whatnot. People can probably think of their favorite example, but if you take a movie like No Country for Old Men, Anton Chigurh, this very unemotional assassin who kind of goes around and just kills for fun, it seems, and doesn't really care much of the havoc that he causes in the course of the movie, right? So this is the concept of an individual like that. And we have ways in which we diagnose individuals with and we give them that label, specifically in forensic context, so in the legal system, right? And this is kind of how it's being used. So the reason why I highlighted how ordinary folks use the term is that we often just use it as an adjective and like, oh, what a psychopath, or things like that. So it's a little bit more profound when scientists and clinicians use the term, right? They are referring to something that is very specific and also typically used as some sort of psychiatric diagnosis.
Yeah, right. It brings to mind how people have sort of taken these common labels and categories that they're familiar with from clinical practice, and they'll dilute them to use them in a variety of contexts. People will say, "Oh, that you're being autistic right now," or
Yeah,
"That person's
yeah,
being OCD,"
yeah,
because they're arranging something or trying to be neat about something.
yeah.
Yeah, and I do wonder how much the adoption of clinical language in ordinary, in like everyday ordinary non-clinical settings can prompt like further misunderstandings of how the various things might be better
It
understood.
can, and it does in this field also, right? So this is, I see it all the time, right? And of course, also I see it in my everyday work, also dealing with students and so on. So we often have to unlearn certain things that we have associated with the term, right? So it's kind of similar to, oh, just because you have a little bit of problems with attention one day doesn't mean that you have attention deficit disorder, right? Like it's kind of the same here, right? So when clinicians say psychopathy or a psychopath, they refer to some very, very grave example of an individual who had like really deep-seated problems. At least that's the idea, right? But ordinary folks sometimes don't have remorse or empathy for certain peoples, but that's not what we're referring to, right?
Yeah. So I have some other questions about sort of the nature of how psychopathy is supposed to be understood or construed. I know we're going to question it from the foundations up, but I still want to get the popular conception down.
Yeah,
And
good.
one of these is related to how you're talking about how it would be handled in a sort of forensic or clinical setting, perhaps, which is, to what extent is it thought of as, to at least some extent, a kind of categorical thing, like you either have it or you don't, uh, rather than it being thought of as something that falls like on a spectrum, because there's like, now it's thought of as autism spectrum, and a person could be thought of as like a little bit autistic or a lot autistic. Of course, that's going to obscure the fact that autism can manifest a number of different things. You might get some of them and not others. And I'm assuming it would be the same thing with psychopathy, or at least allegedly with psychopathy. So to what extent, like, could a person be, for instance, like on the psychopathy scale, but not like sort of from a legal or clinical sense, a psychopath?
Yeah. So there's a couple of questions here, but one is the question about dimensionality, right? So this is a topic that clinicians deal a lot with, is something that scientists talk a lot about, and I assume is also something that we just can intuitively, ordinarily just understand as an idea, right? And there's not necessarily full consensus on how we should think about dimensions in psychiatric research or in clinical practices, but there's two stories, and I think the one story is the correct one, and then the other one is not. It's kind of misleading and also problematic to some extent. But I can start with the one that I think the way we should look at it, right? Let's take something that everybody can relate to, and I think kind of demonstrates the example a little bit better, is that think of major depressive disorder. We have all heard of depression. It's something you can be clinically depressed, and you would usually get the major depressive disorder if you're clinically depressed, right? Now, if you feel sad on a Sunday morning, wake up one morning and you feel really sad, do you think you're on the spectrum of major depressive disorder, but you're just down in the very low end? I think most people would say that seems to just be meaningless because, there is also just such a thing as just being sad. It's just like we can be happy, we can also be sad, and there are many levels to that, right? Now, so this was the first story where I think things goes wrong. All clinical disorders should not be viewed as being on this massive dimension that goes from just a tiny little bit to a lot at the end, other end. We should view perhaps spectrums more in a second way or in a different way, where it's like at some point we have a sort of clinical threshold that we passes where we would say, okay, now we might be depressed to the extent that we associate it with some clinically abnormal level. And then we can talk about spectrums, right? So you can have you can be very depressed clinically or low depressed clinically, still clinically significant, both of them, right? But there are just like spectrums in that sense, right? So the reason why I prefer that way of thinking about dimensions is that if you allow for this massive dimensionality in these labels that we use, you also kind of like water them down. And you also just starts to create a lot of confusion, right? It's not clear to me that being sad one day in a completely ordinary, healthy way has anything to do with major depression, right? It's a major depression seems, for example, to be, it could be, it's usually something that's associated with you all of a sudden being so depressed that you cannot function, right? That you have like deep seated this, like it's really impairing your life, right? But this seems to be just like causally, there seems to be something completely going, completely different going on than if you're just like randomly sad, a little bit sad one Sunday morning, right? The same here when if we pull it back to psychopathy, um, it's very normal for individuals to not feel empathy with everyone they meet in their ordinary life. It's also very normal not to necessarily feel deep remorse about everything that you do in your life that has been slightly bad or something like that. So we all have these. We're just talking about normal functioning, normal psychological dispositions, right? And I don't like the idea that we kind of like bundle all this together with when we talk about psychopathy, this idea that you can be completely deprived of empathy and remorse and emotions and so on, right? So this is how I think about spectrums. So you can definitely be, they could be the stereotypical example of a psychopath or a psychopathic person. This idea, we can appreciate the concept of this. And then we can also appreciate that that comes in degrees, but I don't want to bundle it together with this ordinary low end of the spectrum of ordinary level of feeling or lacking a little bit empathy here and there, right? I do want to hedge that and say that this is like people disagree on this, so I don't want to say like this is how you ought to do it. There are people who definitely would conceptualize psychopathy as being on this large spectrum, in this way that we are all a little bit psychopathic. I don't think it's very informative, and I think it ends up confusing the research also. A final point I want to make here, Lance, is that if you want to do research on spectrums that are that large, it's probably not something that you're going to succeed with, because the broader you make your concepts that you investigate through the scientific method, the more noise you're also going to incorporate into your data, and there is probably going to end up being completely meaningless what you end up analyzing. So it's something that there's pragmatic reasons why I don't want to go there, but I think there's also conceptual reasons, of course.
Yeah. So, yeah, I had another question related to that. I'm trying to remember what it was because it was, I was like, oh, here's a question that occurred to me. I'll try to remember what it was. In the meantime, I'll ask another question. Uh, to what extent do people tend to think of psychopathy as something that would be like congenital, or like you're born that way? And to what extent would they consider that it's possible to like acquire psychopathy? Because I haven't really heard of the latter. It tends to be something that I've heard of it construed as you're born that way. But how do clinicians think about this?
So there's not necessarily agreement on this, or maybe there is agreement that it can be both. But it's true that we tend to have the conversation about psychopathy as something that you're born with. So there's this idea that it's genetic based, right? But again, it's just because it's genetic based doesn't mean that you're born in that sense. It still have to realize itself, right? Um, but um, but no. So there's this idea that psychopathy is definitely something. Usually, most researchers, I think, would describe this. So again, we don't have perfect data on. When I say most researchers, I don't know if it actually is most researchers, but that's my sense at least. It would describe it as a neurodevelopmental disorder. So it's a little bit more tricky, right? So it means that you might have the genetic disposition to develop psychopathy, but it also has to be importantly like nurtured through the environment or something like that, right?
Mhm.
And so it's a little bit of we can make sense of it, but it's also a little bit of a non-answer, right? So it's like hey, why is the nail rusty? Is it because of the metal or because of the environment? Well, it's because of both.
Yeah.
And then you're kind of like left with a completely obvious and trivial or mundane answer to something that's very complicated, right? So the real question is whether you can find, or whether we have indeed found any genetic biomarkers of this condition, right? And the answer to that question is that no, we haven't found any, but we're still searching for them, or some researchers are seemingly still searching for them, right? Yeah.
Okay, so I remember my other question. So it was related to the way in which you prefer to characterize how we go about, like, a labeling whether somebody has something. We might want to avoid trivializing things by putting them on such a broad spectrum. And it's something that I've wondered for a while now about clinical diagnosis, which is that, there's at least a couple things that you could use, and maybe use both together as a diagnostic criteria for whether you're going to say, oh, this person, we're going to say or diagnose them as like having this mental illness. Uh, and, you mentioned dysfunction, and, a lot of times I've seen people say, oh, well, you have the mental illness, like, in order for us to diagnose it, there has to be like clear dysfunction in your life. It has to be impairing you in some way, making things worse for you in some way. But, it makes me wonder, if a person had like a chronic pain condition, but they just had an extremely high pain tolerance and they went about their life and you couldn't tell from the way that they live their life, but then you ask them, are you in pain? They're, oh yeah, it hurts a lot. And
Yeah.
then another person was in a similar amount of pain, but they have poor pain tolerance and they're like writhing on the ground screaming, or they're not able to work. Um, Technically, they have in one sense, the same medical condition from a physiological perspective, and then a different one in terms of the sense in which the way they react to it. So I'm wondering if there's a parallel here where, two people could exhibit similar severity in certain measurable respects in terms of clinical symptoms, but exhibit very strong gaps in terms of functionality, where one of them is like totally dysfunctional and one could be like fairly functional. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering how much there's like a normative, or how much the functional consideration factors in to diagnosing, rather than like raw severity independent of its how
Yeah.
much of an impediment it is to function.
Oh, this is a very tricky question, and it's a great example that you're giving. I think most of all it kind of speaks to the complexity of diagnosing, maybe identifying individuals. So now we're talking about psychopathy, which is usually framed as a personality disorder, right? And maybe individuals could have the same level of lacking emotions or empathy or whatever we're focusing on here, but it expresses itself in all sorts of different ways. And of course, what really eventually becomes a challenge is that you, as a clinician, the only thing you can really do is to look at people's behaviors, so the way things are expressed, right? And you look at that and you try to draw inferences from this. So I think this might actually, it sounds very simple, but I think it might actually be some of the more profound challenges we deal with in mental health research just generally. This is not something that is isolated to psychopathy research. It just maybe illustrates how difficult mental health research really is at the end of the day. Because yeah, I fully agree with you that when it comes to these spectrums or these dimensions of it and how people cope with it, with the level of dysfunction they have, yeah, there's going to be differences. And the pain example is a really good example of that, I think. How there's obvious differences and how the same dysfunction manifests in different behaviors, right? And maybe that's also why we don't make much progress in mental health research in general, is because it's so damn difficult, right? Because of things like this, and this is just one out of many, right? I don't know if I
Yeah.
even answered your question, but I
Well,
think
I,
it
I
just
kind of threw it at you, but I don't know that it would be easy to give like a principled answer. It's like I'm flagging this as this seems really hard to work through. And I don't know it.
yeah.
I could imagine someone taking a different perspective and different perspectives on this, at least at present, seeming pretty defensible.
I think this is some of the one of the many challenges we deal with in mental health research. And I haven't I don't want to pretend that we have good ways to get around it. We try to by developing all sorts of standardized assessments and so on, but they don't really resolve the problems, I think, the challenges. And at the end of the day, this is gonna end up affecting the data that you get out of your studies, and then of course also your analysis, and then the knowledge production downstream, right? So but I do want to say something, one more point that I realized when we talked about dimensionality, right? And I say that people disagree on the different types of dimensionality of disorders. Researchers tend to disagree on this question, right? So, but in clinical settings, and this kind of goes back to when you were drawing a connection to the legal system and how this diagnosis is used. We have already kind of made the decision that we speak about spectrums or dimensions from the clinical level and beyond, right? Not we start with the clinical significance, and the way this kind of like is the view of the clinical community is that it's in our diagnostic manuals, right? So, for example, psychopathy is a personality disorder. It's a type of personality disorder. Before you can have personality disorder, you need to have an enduring pattern of like dysfunctional ways of thinking and behavior and emoting, right? So there has to be a level of dysfunction before we say you have a personality disorder, right? So that's that was just like a little bit of a side remark. So it's already implemented in our diagnostic kind of like approaches, if you will.
That brings to mind another question. And yeah, I know we haven't even got into the critique of psychopathy, but I feel like there's a lot of groundwork that we should cover.
Yeah, there's.
So one of them would be, and I just don't know the answer to this, is there a difference? And if so, how much of a difference between how psychopathy tends to be treated from a sort of clinical or therapeutic perspective, and then how it's handled from a sort of legal or forensic perspective? Because, and I guess I'll say a little bit about why I'm asking that. I don't know how often it comes up in like a criminal defense trial where a person says like, I'm a psychopath and this is like, it's exculpatory to some extent. And how, because it seems like it's not that common. And yet then I see data saying like, some outrageous percentage of the people that are actually in prison score pretty high on like psychopathy skills. So we got like psychopaths, and then that's not seeming to influence sentencing or coming up in trial. So, there seems to be a disparity there that seems a little curious to me. So yeah, I guess
no, I
having
mean,
made that observation, yeah, how do we go about addressing this from the forensic or legal perspective, and then from the sort of clinical or therapeutic perspective?
So if I can just like address that like how is this psychopathy diagnosing influencing, if at all, legal decision making? So it is true that the way we assess psychopathy today, a lot of people in the prison system, for example, would meet those diagnostic criteria for psychopathy. And then you're making the observation that it doesn't seem to be something that defense attorneys use for exculpatory purposes. So you don't get off the hook because you have been diagnosed with psychopathy. And that is absolutely true. It's very unusual, if it has ever even occurred in the North American system, to get a person not criminal, get the verdict not criminally responsible because that they had psychopathy. That happens a lot with psychotic disorders such as schizophrenia or other very serious mental health diagnosis, but not with psychopathy. On the other hand, however, the way psychopathy usually finds its way into relevance in legal decision making is through constricting or restricting decision making, meaning that it can lead to higher sentences. It can lead to, or I should say, non-mitigated sentences, meaning that you usually get it can lead to the strongest decision in sentencing within the sentencing framework. It can also lead to something like it being placed in maximum security facilities. It can lead to preference over prison sentence over community sentence or over probation. It can be used to deny a person parole, for example. There's all sorts of ways that a psychopathy diagnosis is indeed influencing legal decision making. So this is some of the majority of my research is kind of looking into that, like how is this diagnosis impacting legal decision making? And what we find is that With all the caveats, it can be very difficult to analyze how single information, such as a diagnosis, influence decision making, because decision making in the legal system is not exactly fully transparent. So there's a large challenge there to actually figure this out. But we do have access to a lot of information still, and the information suggests that it can have very profound impacts on a person's life and as a justice involved person. Usually, or perhaps always, is always going to be restrictive in some sense.
Yeah. So if they're using that if they're using this as a criteria, and it looks like the consequences are mostly bad for the person that is convicted of a crime, can they like refuse to do a test? Like it doesn't seem like it would be there in there an incentive to get it diagnosed or labeled this way.
Yeah, this is one of the what should we call it? Some of the I believe is a little bit of an professional ethical tension here when you're being tasked with diagnosing a person or assessing a person for psychopathy, whether you as a clinician should actually continue doing so, because it seems to never be in your patient or in your client's interest to get this diagnosis, right? There's a little bit of a tension in the field whether we should allow these assessments to even occur. we have ethical obligations as clinicians. These are very clear cut, and it seems like there's a little bit of a tension there, yeah, because indeed it's never going to be in your best interest to get this diagnosis, which is kind of odd, right? Because we usually have health diagnostics to help people with their lives, right? And this is not one of them. It seems this is just only seems to be something you would by all means avoid having on your record as an individual. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it seems it's immediately making me think administering a test requires informed consent for ethical reasons. And, it would make sense to inform the person there are no benefits to doing this. It only brings risks to you. And those risks can be severe. You could get like lower chance of parole. You could get sentenced to a worse type of prison. Uh, I can't imagine you explaining that to somebody and saying there are no benefits, there are only costs, and then going, oh, okay, let me fill this out. And it also seems like they have a right to not fill it out. Like you can't compel. Otherwise, what is compelled speech or like forcing them to give you answers to questions? That's also unethical. So this never occurred to me, but it's like that seems kind of messed up.
Yeah, you're hitting a nerve. I've made this argument in review work, but also in my book that I've recently published, that I do think this is actually against our ethical commitments as healthcare professionals. Now, there are different contexts where it might not be, but in most contexts, it will be against, I believe, our ethical commitments as psychologists or psychiatrists or whatever your discipline is. I can tell you where I think it might not be. So there are some cases where you might simply be assessing a person in non-therapeutic context. So as a psychiatrist, for example, psychiatrists in North America do have in their ethical framework that they can perform some assessments if it's a non-therapeutic context. So they can go in and assess a person on the behalf of a third party, for example, a court or something like that. So this would be some exceptions. Now, psychologists do not seem to have that in a straightforward way, but there's still other aspects of our ethical obligations where it still seems to be a little bit suspicious. But I don't want to go there now. That would be a little bit. If people are interested in this, they can look at some of my work. But yeah, I think this is. We should probably shouldn't be doing this, but then you also ask the question: couldn't a person just refuse? Like, couldn't I just say no? If you're planning on doing a psychopathy assessment of me, I've refused to take part in this. And the answer is that yes, you can refuse, but that doesn't guarantee that they're not going to do it in the legal system. They might still just say, fine, you don't agree with the interview. then we're just going to ask the clinician to evaluate your records and your history and whatever information we have of you. And this is, I see this over and over again. This happens quite a lot. And then again, you might say this sounds very shady and unethical, and I would say I would agree with you. Yeah, I don't think this is something we should do. To this, I can also finally say maybe the reason why some people do not say no to these assessments is probably because they know they can have downstream consequences. So if you offer parole and it says in your parole application that Lance refused to participate in an interview with our clinical psychologist, how do you think that's going to impact your parole?
That's a good. Yeah.
So then you can say, well, then you will never get informed consent because there's always a coercive element, right? Because in voluntary informed consent, for it to be informed consent, it has to be voluntary. And since you always have a coercive element, you have to be very suspicious whether you can even achieve proper informed consent as a forensic psychologist. But now we're getting into the weeds and
This is like great stuff. I feel like this could be a whole discussion in its own right. So maybe we should put a pin in it and revisit that in another discussion.
Yeah, I mean, we can. It becomes more complicated, I think, once we dive into the research, because you know, a lot of people defend this diagnosis because they assume that there's good research to back it up, that we actually understand the diagnosis and we have good evidence to suggest that it exists, and we have evidence to suggest that it can inform decision making in the legal system. But as I have showed in my work, this is not the case. Like, there isn't good evidence to support this diagnosis, and then I think the ethical question becomes amplified in a way, right? Because then you really have to ask yourself, what are you really doing then? Like.
Yeah, so let's get into that. Let's get into like I don't even know where to start, because there's like multiple angles you could take. So I'll let you decide how you want to do it. What is your critique of psychopathy? Why should we be skeptical of it? And what exactly should we be skeptical of in particular?
Okay, so let me give you the overall rundown of all of this. So of course, psychopathy is this personality disorder, or this diagnosis, or this clinical construct. People use different terms, but they're addressing this concept of these individuals who have all these sorts of dysfunctions that regards emotions and pro-social behaviors and so on. Now, there are roughly 5 claims that are associated with this diagnosis that has kind of been the 5 core claims that has impacted legal decision making. And the first claim is that individuals with a psychopathy diagnosis, that they are extraordinarily dangerous, or they're very high risk individuals in a forensic context. And the second claim is that they cannot be treated, that they are incorrigible forever, kind of, which of course is different from most justice involved individuals. People tend to be of higher risk in their young age, and then as they age and get older and older, they tend to be less risk, right? Where the claim with psychopathic persons is that whatever risk levels they have as young, they kind of just they remain the same throughout their lives, right? So, and the third claim is that they have these extreme personality traits, such as lacking empathy, or lacking remorse, or having no emotions, and so on. So we have this idea of an individual who just have no real comprehension of the moral fabric of our society, right? And then we have these 2 additional claims, namely that it's a neurological condition, often paired with the genetic stuff also, meaning that it's a biological condition, and we kind of know biologically what's going on. And the 5th claim is that we have good, solid, corroborated theories of what's going on. So in other words, the scientists can explain the phenomenon that they're observing, right? Those 5 claims have historically kind of gone together to kind of substantiate why we should start assessing individuals in the justice system for psychopathy. And by extension, they also, these 5 claims also informs the decision making we make about these individuals. So you might say, oh, okay, so maybe it's just a couple of individuals here and there we assess for psychopathy. No, in the 1990s, we started almost at an industrial scale to start assessing people for psychopathy in the legal system. So in the 1990s, this practice really took speed. So when we reached the 2000 and 2010s, one of the most common assessments that was done in forensic psychological context was to assess individuals for psychopathy. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of individuals in United States alone who has undergone a psychopathy assessment and perhaps also received the diagnosis, right? So all these individuals would have gone through the legal system and having their decision making about them been informed by this label, psychopathy, but also these 5 claims that I mentioned, right? So you will the 2 claims that are obviously maybe for obvious reasons would be most impactful is the high risk claim, like this idea of a very dangerous individual paired with an individual that doesn't change, right? That you cannot treat, right? This is perhaps the most important ones, right? We see this also in legal decision making when we look at the documents for how people make decisions, right? Like, for example, there's obvious ways in which it would impact. So, for instance, when you opt for a parole decision, something that the parole board has to evaluate is, of course, whether you're gonna recidivate when you're out, whether you're gonna be reconvicted for a new crime when you're out. Because if they think so, they're not gonna let you out on parole. They're just gonna keep you in the correctional facility, obviously, right? So, but if you have an individual who is just by that label being a psychopath, considered high risk, that's already going to weigh against you, right? But let's just say that you, in the meantime that you were in prison, have been participating in a rehabilitation program, say a anger management treatment program or something like that. The parole board might make the judgment, well, since you are untreatable, you have not benefited from this program, right? So therefore, again, we're not gonna give you parole, right, or something like that. So we see these evidence of this sort of thinking wherever we look in the legal system, look through documents. This is what we're seeing, right? That it informs decision making in this way.
All right. All right. So you listed these 5 things. Do you want to go through them and address like what the claim is, and then what the evidence is supposed to be for them, and then like what the issue with that is?
Yeah, of course. So I just want to also like preempt a little bit that there are many other claims being made about psychopathy, and researchers don't necessarily agree on all claims, but these are like the 5 core claims that I think seem to be mainstream, at least to some extent. The first claim is the idea that individuals who are diagnosed with psychopathy are also very dangerous, meaning that compared to people without the diagnosis in our legal system, they would have higher recidivism rates, they would have more violent crimes, and so on. In other words, that they are the worst of the worst, if you will, that we have in the legal system. So, of course, I think everybody can trivially kind of or intuitively understand that not everyone is of equal risk, right? So some people will commit crimes and they will go to prison, for example, and that's going to be the last crime that they ever committed in their lives, and they're going to rehabilitate back into society, and that's all good. But some people don't, right? Some people are lifelong involvement with the legal system, constantly being apprehended for all sorts of violations of the criminal code, right? And these would be your high risk individuals. Now, so we have studied this, right? It's important to remember here that this is an empirical claim. It's not, we can appreciate the conceptual notion that a psychopath is much more dangerous. We can say that, and it's free to say that, right? But we also have to remember it's an empirical claim. So the empirical claim is the following, that if you took a group of individuals with a psychopathy diagnosis and a group of individuals who do not have the diagnosis, well, what you should find is that that the one group will in the future show evidence of being much more dangerous than the other group. In other words, that if we went into your neighborhood prison, Lance, and we did an experiment, and we took 200 individuals who wanted to participate, and we assessed them all for psychopathy, so we know who are the psychopaths and who are the non-psychopaths. And then if we, on a Wednesday morning, we set them all loose in society, what we should find over a period of time is that the psychopath group has a lot more individuals who got reconvicted for a crime compared to the non-psychopath, right? That's what that claim really just means in a forensic context. Now, so we have done those studies, like quite literally, actually. Of course, not in this comical sense where we said everybody lose on a Monday morning, but we do it exactly in this way, where we go into a correctional facility, for example, and then we assess individuals who participate in our study, and then we wait 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and then we look at their reconviction rates because we have access to their records, right? And what we find is very underwhelming. What we find is that there is a difference between the two groups, but the difference is either very small or only moderate, meaning that yeah, there is a difference around the mean. The psychopath group tend to have more on average reconvictions, for example, if you're measuring reconvictions. But so does the other group. The other group also has a lot of reconvictions, and the difference between them is quite underwhelming. It's not like, it does not corroborate this idea that the one group is way more dangerous than the other group, right? I could run some very dry statistics at you if you wanted that, but that might might bore a lot of the listeners. But I could say, like, in something that might intuitively be more appreciative. So, for example, the risk overlap, or the level of dangerousness, you will, between the two groups has much more overlap than what actually separates them. And what that really means is that if you took a random person from your psychopath group, there's only going to be a slightly higher chance that they have a recidivism rate that is higher than the person from the non-psychopath group. And the numbers are roughly like this. If you took a random person from your psychopath group, only in 65% of the cases would that person have a higher recidivism rate compared to the non-psychopath person. Okay, so of course, if there was complete overlap, it would be only half of the times, right? In 50% of the times, but now there's 65%, so they actually have a lot of overlap. Another way to put this would be like, hey, if you're a forensic clinician, or let's say that you're a parole board member, and Lance is up for parole, and we look at Lance's score on psychopathy assessment and say, oh, he's been diagnosed with psychopathy. If you infer that Lance is high risk, or higher risk, relatively higher risk because of this score, you would be right in 65% of times. But in the other third, in the 35% of times, you would actually be wrong, right? So you see the implication here is that it will on average give you the slight indication. You could say, oh, he might be a little bit more dangerous, but you would almost just as often be wrong, right? And I should here emphasize also that you can never infer from this score, because of the great overlap, that the person will be of high risk. You can only say that they're of relatively higher risk. And what exactly that means can be very difficult to interpret, right? So we're not talking about the worst of the worst here. It's not what we're saying, right? I should also say, and this would be very boring statistics, but there's a lot of caveats to these statistics also. So there's a lot of what we call in statistics moderating variables. So these statistics don't generalize across populations, for example. They tend to be lower in US settings compared to Canadian settings, for example. So there's a lot of underwhelming performance, or you should say underwhelming associations between psychopathy and forensic risk. And the irony is also that if you really want to predict who is of high risk, you're actually much better off using a risk assessment tool that has been specifically developed for this, right? And the irony here, of course, is that, well, psychopaths were supposed to be the worst of the worst, and how come you can just develop a tool that is better at selecting high-risk individuals that does not look for psychopathy, right? So this is probably some of the most interesting findings that has occurred over the last 10 to 15 years, I would say. It was a conclusion we became aware of around 2008, after there had been like a relatively high influx of these types of studies. And then as we moved towards the 2010s, it's just become cemented and something that we are very aware of now. Yeah, so this is really underwhelming. I don't know if you want me to address the other 4 claims.
Well, I'm very interested. So the first thing I started thinking of are, what are the caveats and qualifiers? I mean, it's one of those things that happens when you're in grad schools. You start looking for, but what about this confound? What about this moderator? Did you check for this? Did you check for that? It's like one of the first things I started thinking was, well, wouldn't it might matter what kind of crime you're looking at. So one of my first thoughts was, maybe people that are diagnosed with psychopathy are more likely to recidivate specifically for violent crimes. And then the people that are not diagnosed with psychopathy, they're committing more like nonviolent crimes, like they're more likely to be drug dealers or commit fraud. And so
Yeah.
actually, if you look at the type of crime, then they're more dangerous in the sense, not simply in brutally quantifying the amount of crime committed, but the type of crime committed. And I'm assuming it would be insane to me if that wasn't already addressed in this. So I'm assuming it is.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's and again, I don't think it's a big surprise, but but the psychopathy diagnosis is less associated with violent crimes compared to general recidivism, non-violent crimes, for example. So there's also something there. But again, it's all very underwhelming, moderate effect sizes. But yeah, so people have looked at this. They've also looked at, is there any association between instrumental violence as opposed to reactive violence, for example? And again, doesn't ping out the way that the concept suggests, at least.
Okay, I have a million questions about how this is handled legally within the U.S. and outside of it, but I'm going to set those aside because I want to get through these, and I don't know, like, if you feel like it's too much detail, we could skip ahead. But the next one on your list was like the treatability of this, because that's one of the things I had always heard. Because I'm not in clinical psychology; I'm not treating that. Sometimes people think, because I have my PhD is in psychology, they'll be like, "Oh, are you going to psychoanalyze me?" Or they think I'd put people on the couch and talk to them. No, I do research, and it has nothing to do with mental health stuff at all. But you still like absorb by osmosis like various sorts of claims.
Yeah.
And one of them that I definitely heard over and over and over, almost like it's like a religious mantra, is psychopaths are, unlike so many other mental health issues, it's totally untreatable. You can't do anything for them. They're stuck the way that they are. I've also heard this about people with like narcissism. So I don't know if you know much about that, but I'd be curious if you have thoughts on that. But like, I'm generally curious about claims of untreatability. So how it applies to psychopathy, but just also generally, I don't even know what it's supposed to mean exactly. Not that it's meaningless or anything, but when people say it's not treatable, what that looks like and how they draw those conclusions. Like, what is that based on?
Yeah, so there's a long history of viewing certain mental health diagnoses as untreatable. When it comes to personality disorders, so also narcissistic personality disorder or borderline and so on, it's been just traditionally associated with this view that there's not much we can do as clinicians. People would say this is, in the 1990s, this was referred to as the nothing works period. But we've become far more optimistic in recent years that no, that there seems to be something you can do to assist individuals who have personality disorders in general, but also with psychopathy. Now, I should just like quickly hedge the conversation and say that as a clinician with any form of therapy, there's so many variables that, of course, can impact the outcome of a treatment or a therapeutic process, right? Sometimes the therapist doesn't match well with the person who is being treated, and that can have all sorts of impacts. It's not like just taking a pill and then you're fine, right? That's not how things work. Unfortunately, it's just not how it works, right? And now in forensic settings, this is particularly the case because in forensic settings, you're often dealing with individuals who have many more problems than just this one thing. Like, so you might be dealing with a person who has been diagnosed with psychopathy, but that person might also have other mental health diagnoses, and they might have a substance misuse problem, and so on and so forth, right? So the success rate for therapeutic intervention in forensic context is usually assumed to be much lower compared to in civil context, right? So, but let's leave that aside for a moment, and that's might not be so important for the conversation right now. But so what we have found, and I'm happy that you're stressing this, that you have kind of heard that psychopaths cannot be treated, because that was very much a mantra, if you will. It was kind of baked into the concept itself from the very beginning. Well, I shouldn't say from the very beginning, but at least since after Second World War, it was very much just something people assumed, that there was nothing you could do as a therapist. There was even also the claim that if you tried to help people with psychopathy, they would actually get worse. So there was adverse treatments effects. That was also a very common claim in the 1990s, as late as the 1990s. But also, even some people are still, I still see evidence that people are claiming this. And it's important to just for me to say that that's like, it's not based in any scientific research, this view here. It might be based on some form of clinical experience, maybe, but there's no scientific evidence to suggest that there's nothing you can do as a therapist. So the way we usually measure effects of treatment in forensic context is usually in whether you can impact the recidivism rates after a person is released from prison. So many of these forensic rehabilitation programs, we call them rehabilitation programs. It's an awful word, but leave that aside. What we often do is that we work with people in a way where we try to help them with the problems that specifically lead them to get in contact with the justice system, right? So maybe we want to help them with, combating all sorts of problems that relates to substance misuse and whatnot, right? But so the claim here would be that if psychopathy cannot be treated, the claim would be that if you took a prison, for example, and you took people with psychopathy, they're not offered any rehabilitation, and you took people with psychopathy who were offered rehabilitation, the claim would be that they would have exactly the same recidivism rate when they are released from prison, right? That would be the claim here. But that's not what we find. When we're starting to have like quite a good number of studies. I think we have in somewhere in the high 40s of studies that has investigated this in some form or the other. It can be very difficult to make randomized control studies in this context here, I should just say. So the evidence we have is always going to be of suboptimal quality according to what we would ideally want to do, but that has something to do with psychiatric therapeutic research in general. It can be very tricky to have to obtain this rigorousness in your methods, but that's another question. The question is whether there's evidence that psychopathic persons don't benefit from treatment, or that they get worse, and the answer to that is just like, it's just a resounding no. No, you can actually benefit from treatment. Of course, again, the exact degree of benefit is always going to be relatively small compared to other settings, but nevertheless, it's just not true that you cannot do anything about it.
So I could still see someone saying, okay, well, we don't have to make such a strong claim, which is that there's no treatment effect, provided that the treatment effect is comparatively so low compared to non-psychopaths. So I'm assuming that this has already been addressed, but you could run a test where you have people diagnosed as psychopaths that get the treatment and don't, and then people not diagnosed as psychopaths that get the treatment and don't. And then you look at to see if whether the disparity in clinical treatment is much higher in the case of the non-psychopaths. Have people done that? And if so, what did they find?
Yeah, so ideally what you would have access to is some sort of meta-analysis or like large-scale synthesis of data, right? We don't want to base our conclusion on one single study, right? So, and currently we don't have in the field. I know that I know one research group that is working on a systematic review of this evidence. Um, so I wouldn't say that we have like a good view of like how large these impacts of the treatment is. But my understanding is that it's meaningful. That you have plenty of studies at least that show a meaningful benefit from treatment, where it's definitely not that we can rule that it's pointless. So this is, I know that's a low bar. But it's forensic settings, and the reason why, I mean, people have to understand the complexity of offending behavior. You don't get involved with the justice system just because of one thing, right? It's often a plethora of things, right? It can substance misuse, other mental health diagnoses, living situations, economics, like all sorts of things play a role. And you, as a therapist, you cannot touch on all these issues, right? You can only really deal with things that has to do with the person themselves, right? So even if you really succeed at having a great therapeutic process with an individual, it might be that there are other things that does that they end up in the legal system again, right? But overall, the general consensus in the field, and again, this is not just like my opinion or anything like that. The general consensus, if you pick up any review study of the treatment literature, you will find that they say something to this extent, that yeah, there's evidence that it works, that we can actually do something. However, you shouldn't be too optimistic. There are limitations to what you can do, but this seems to just more be like a general conclusion about working in forensic settings, right? Yeah.
So I'm thinking about what like someone skeptical of this that is more inclined to think that it's not treatable might say, and I get this. I guess it also could be borne out in the data. So there's a couple things that could explain like a treatment effect. One would be a sort of across the board, relatively like modest treatment for everybody, like people all benefit a bit. Um, but it could also be that there's a subset of people that benefit a whole lot, and then most of the other people don't. And then the argument could be actually what's happening is that the appearance of a treatment effect is driven by a subset of the people being misdiagnosed as psychopaths, and actually the real psychopaths, they remain untreatable, and so you have the illusion of a real treatment effect. Would that be ruled out by the data that we have?
I don't know if anyone has made that analysis. I cannot think of it, at least. I would say that that's absolutely a possibility. And then we would have to go and find the data. So if a person want to make that argument, they would have to go and search for it, right? And search for the evidence. I have not seen it. The reason why I wouldn't be too optimistic or I shouldn't say it that way. I wouldn't expect that would ping out. Is that what we see is that there's like we have now so many studies, right? That would be very strange if it was the same thing that kind of repeated across studies like this, right? But it's certainly possible. It's certainly possible that there's like anomalies or there's some signal in the data that we haven't seen, right? But I can also say there's also like anecdotal evidence, right, where clinicians say that, who challenge this idea that there's nothing you can do. You know, they say like, listen, whether you're a psychopath or not, you are still an intelligent person in the sense that you can recognize that being in prison might not be to your advantage, and you are, after a while being in prison, you might be willing to listen to things that might be able to keep you out of prison, and that is really just what we're doing as therapists, right? We're assuming that individuals they have some level of executive control, and they're able to identify why they're here in prison, right? And they would like to avoid being here in the future, right? And so whether you have a personality disorder or not, it seems like that there's just this straightforward way in which that it would be odd to categorically just assume nobody can be treated, right? So, but of course, it might be that we one day find that it cannot be treated, right? But currently, the evidence suggests otherwise, right? That's, as a scientist, really all you can do, right?
Yeah, no, and I recognize that that's ad hoc. I'm just trying to give the perspective of
Yeah.
like, what would a person say if they were really skeptical of this? But that's another thing. And perhaps you know some of the details. Do you know what the treatment looks like? So for instance, do they give people do they say, okay, these people have been diagnosed with psychopathy, let's give them like psychopathy specific treatments, or do they just give people standard treatment? Like, do they go to anger management? Like, what does the actual treatment look like that people are receiving? And does it differ from the treatment they would otherwise receive, like counterfactually, were they not diagnosed with psychopathy?
Yeah. There were some attempts in the late 1990s and early 2000s to develop treatment programs that were like specifically tailored to psychopathic individuals. There's a couple of researchers in Canada actually looked at this. I don't think that program ever really materialized in any like widespread practices. To my knowledge, there's still no like uniquely tailored program. So if the psychopathy diagnosis informs treatment is probably more on a one-to-one basis, where the clinician themselves will say, oh, this person has a psychopathy diagnosis. Let me see how I'm going to adjust my personal approach to this person. The evidence that we have access to in the science, the vast majority of studies are just individuals who have been enrolled in any program offered at an institution, right? So typically these studies will go into specific rehabilitation program, and then they will try to measure the effects, right, that it has. And part of the data collection involves assessing individuals in the program with a psychopathy assessment, right? So they will know in the data who would have the diagnosis or not, but the therapist might not, who's in control of the study,
Okay.
might not. So there's, but it varies across studies. So I wouldn't necessarily say might be always how people do it, but there are many different types of studies, and there's not necessarily methodological uniformity across these studies. Yeah.
No, I get that. Like, I've seen that there's like a trillion scales for everything in clinical psych. So
Yeah.
there's going to be a million ways to measure it, a million ways to assess things. It's way worse than what I deal with in my field.
Yeah.
I don't think I could. Maybe I would love it actually, because it'd give me a lot to work with. But that's a whole other thing. So then a couple more questions about that. Have they looked at whether a person that initially received a diagnosis, like using a particular measure, undergoes significant treatment, and then like the actual scores on a psychopathy measure go down, or is it that they remain the same or they don't measure it, and then just the behavior changes?
Yeah, there are. I know of a couple of studies that have done that, but it's usually not the outcome you look for.
Okay.
So because there's a trivial sense in which that a psychopathy score will always go down once you're in prison, because a psychopathy assessment, the tools that we use to assess psychopathy usually take into account like offenses. And of course, if you have been in prison, you might not have more like in recent years have any offenses, right? Or offending behavior or anything like that, right? And then it's always going to dip in a way. So it becomes a little bit messy to measure treatment outcomes in that sense. So what people really want to like look for, what researchers typically want to look for, is whether your treatment has any impact on offending behavior. That's really what we're interested in, right? Because it also ties together with the demands from the legal system. The legal system want to know whether, if a person has been enrolled in a rehabilitation program, whether that's going to lower their risk. That's typically what they're interested in, because that's the decision they have to make, right? Do I give this person parole? Hey, let me see, did they enroll in some treatment program? And if they did, maybe that's gonna like make me more inclined to grant this person parole, right? So this typically what the studies will look at. But there are there are studies that look at like self-improvement scales. So they would have like a person fill out whether they think this treatment had benefited them. And again, these studies also show that, people with psychopathy would report that they feel like this has helped them, right? Um, there's all sorts of ways you can try to measure treatment improvement, but it is a very tricky thing. So they tend to want to keep it simple and keep it at something concrete like reoffending behavior.
Yeah, no, I get why you would rely on measures like that, especially at scale if you're dealing with the criminal justice system and there's like hundreds of thousands or millions of people that you're managing. Things are expensive, they take time. There's courts of, there's so many reasons why. It does bother me a little bit to know that there are certain sort of qualitative aspects of people's behavior that are going to be missed out when you use measures that, like if you zoom out, they make sense, but if you zoom in, we're overlooking a lot of stuff because
Mm.
somebody could not recidivate but still like exhibit aggressive behavior that doesn't rise to the level of like actually reoffending.
Mm.
Now obviously I would take like like recidivism rate as a proxy for how much of that is going on that you're not seeing,
Yeah.
but there's like there's stuff that you could be like, there's a richer pool of data that we're unfortunately, I think, by practicality missing out on. I don't know
Yeah.
that I don't have a question there. It's just
No,
observing that
I
that's the
mean, the
frustrating
comment
nature of measurement.
has, I can give you some, like, the treatment literature is probably, let me see if I don't want to say something that's an overstatement. No, the treatment literature is probably, of all the subfields in psychopathy research, is probably the least developed. So we have a lot of really good research on most of these sub claims that I have mentioned, these 5 claims, for example. And the treatment studies are probably, or the treatment literature is probably least developed, meaning that it's the field where we have the fewest studies, but also the studies that are operating with the most methodological, challenges but on top of that, you can, if you understand a little bit about academic funding structures, and you understand that there has been this narrative that, as you have heard just from being a graduate student in psychology, that there's nothing you can do to treat psychopathy. If you understand a little bit about academic funding structures, you can see how a grant proposal to go and test a treatment program on psychopathy might get rejected. If people just assume that it's not going to work, then they say, we're not going to give you money for this futile project, right? So when you read the literature from the 1990s and early 2000s, you see researchers claiming that complaining about the fact that to get funding for these studies is just almost near impossible. So this is one of the things that has changed in the last 10 to 15 years, that we have started to see more of these treatment studies. So, but it's still underdeveloped, but again, it doesn't fit with this general narrative still. The evidence base, even if it's limited, it still doesn't give you any reason to conclude that psychopathy is untreatable. That's kind of just the claim I'm making here, right?
Okay. So I know we got 3 more things, so I want to make sure that we get all of them. So let's go to the third one, which is like these extreme traits, like there's a alleged lack of empathy, remorse, no emotion, that sort of thing. So that's one of the claims. How do you go about critiquing that?
Yeah, so the idea, or the general idea with psychopathy, is that they have some overall incapacity to understand moral rules or moral norms. So researchers disagree about the details of what that amounts to. So historically, they people take different views. If you go far back in history, psychopathy was framed as a disease of the moral faculty. So you can go all the way back to the U.S. listeners, to good old Benjamin Rush, a co-signer of the Declaration of Independence. He's actually the first one to propose psychopathy as a disorder. It was in a speech at the Philosophical Society in Philadelphia in 1786. That's the oldest I've been able to locate in my research. And he describes, he doesn't call it psychopathy, he calls it anomia, and later he would call it moral derangement. And he described it as a disease of the moral faculty. And people who are viewing the video can see this phrenology statue I have up here. This, of course, ties back to phrenology, where you believe that there was a part of your brain that, of course, Benjamin Rush's statement was before phrenology established itself as a field, but it was very much believed that our mind, or perhaps also our brain, was made into these faculties that control different types of our psychology. And one, of course, was the moral faculty, that controlled everything we do that has to do with morality, and also just our comprehension of moral norms. So what is right and wrong? And Benjamin Rush proposed that you could be diseased in that part of the mind, right? Now, something. Fast forward, this idea kind of prevails in researchers' narrative or in their theories about psychopathy, and then it becomes more like you see very influential North American researchers saying, like they're using terms like moral color blindness or something like that, right? So now, so there's this idea that psychopathy is a disorder that has to do with an incapacity or a severe dysfunction in interpreting morality. So how is that manifested, right? That's the question. How do we measure that, right? So there's different research paradigms that has tested all sorts of facets about this idea, right? So there are some very simple studies done where they take people with a psychopathy diagnosis and people without, and then they ask them questions about morality, and then see if they answer differently, right? So they will give them, for example, moral dilemma questions, trolley problems and things like that. And, if a person has no clue what morality is, then they might, take a very utilitarian standpoint on the trolley problem, or at least their answers could be thought to deviate from what an average person would answer, right? And what they find in these studies is that they seem to have exactly the same responses to any other person, right? But the more sophisticated research, and also by far the largest paradigm in this field, is the empathy research. So psychopathy is often described as this grave dysfunction or incapacity to empathize with people, and this can be tested in all sorts of ways. And I don't know, Lance, if you want me to run through this literature real quick.
If you have I don't know how much time you want to
No,
spend on
no,
this. I mean, that's
we
up to
can do
you.
it, absolutely.
Cool, let's do
I'll
it.
try to keep it short, but so empathy, to those who are familiar with what empathy is, there might be some people have done research on it that is listening in, right? But but empathy is can come in many different types. So empathy researchers believe there are different subtypes of empathy, but usually when we say empathy, we often talk about two types of empathy. One is what we call affective empathy. So, Lance, if you're feeling sad, um, I might start to also feel sad if I have empathy for you. So your sadness gets mirrored in me. I start feeling sad. That's affective empathy. But we can also have cognitive empathy, as is usually described. So if you're feeling sad right now and you're not telling me you're feeling sad, I might still be able to read off you that you are sad. Or if you're feeling happy, or if you're feeling content, or if you're, in other words, I can kind of read your emotions without you telling me what you're feeling. So that's usually referred to as cognitive empathy. So there are different ways that psychologists can measure these types of empathy. So they have developed all sorts of tests that they can give people, right? So we have roughly 66 studies. This was what we found in a systematic review we did 2 years ago. So it's a decent evidence base, 66 studies where we have taken individuals with a psychopathy diagnosis and people without, and then we have measured their how they perform on these empathy tests. And one type of test is very straightforward. It's where you are simply just shown images of people who are expressing stereotypical type of emotions. So person can be looking sad or happy or bored or whatnot, right? And then you have like a multiple choice that you can kind of like click. What do you think the person is feeling in this image, right? Now, and then of course that test will give like a score, like a point score, and then you can see how well you performed on that. You can even do them on the internet if you want to, but these are called emotion recognition tests. So the idea, of course, is that if you don't have any empathy, that your capacity is severely diminished for cognitive empathy, then you should at least be scoring low on these tests. It's a decent hypothesis to make that inference at least, right? Now, what we find in those studies is that it's more or less all null findings. So the null findings in emotion recognition is close to 90%. In psychology, as you might know, that is very high because psychology data sets are known to contain a lot of false positives, right? So when you have a null ratio, where a null ratio here, to people who are not like tuned in on what psychology research usually do, to have a null finding just means that you didn't find any difference between test participants, right? So every time a researcher has measured something in these test results, we call that an effect. And across all these effects, so we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of measurements, are close to 90% on null findings. And what we also did in that review, which is very something that psychologists are starting to do more and more, is we bend all the studies into those who are high quality and those who are low quality, because there's a suspicion in psychology that low quality studies, they yield a lot of null findings, right? So what we should look at is the better methodology studies, the studies that use better statistics and so on. And what we should find, if there isn't a real effect, what we should find is that the quality studies, the high quality studies, really track something that is true. What we found in this research literature is that the null findings are even higher in high quality studies, meaning that the better the study, the more inclined it is to not find anything at all. And the null findings in high quality studies goes to 95%. If that number sounds familiar to you, it's probably because that you know that the the threshold for testing a significant result or designating an effect as significant is the probability value, or alpha, of 0.05, right? So it's very suspicious that we find essentially 100% null findings, right, in this field. It is I want to say the final point, Lance, that this is actually quite remarkable, because most of the psychopathy research I'm referencing here was produced prior to 2015. And you might, having some background, having background in psychology, you might remember that something was going on in 2011, 2012 when we started talking about false positive psychology, where, you know, researchers were starting to talk about, oh, we have so much flexibility in our analysis, we can generate effects out of pure cloth, right, if we want to. This is what led to the replication crisis, of course. So think about this. We have a field that yields almost 100% null findings, and the research is still conducted under extremely flexible conditions. It's published in a period where it was completely accepted to use any flexibility you wanted, really, but you still couldn't produce any significant results. That says a lot, right?
Yeah, I mean, just because I'm very familiar with the whole replication crisis, just because, you know, I started my PhD in 2015, and that's right when that like shit hit the fan.
Okay, yeah, good. So you
in social psychology, which is what I did my PhD in. You had the big 100 research. Yeah, you know, the Nozick team.
Yeah,
Open science. Yeah. So that paper was one of the first papers we went over in our big seminars where we all got together, and people were panicking. Like, it was a big deal. And I don't think people realize just how possible it is to manipulate the analysis of, like, you could just take raw data where you didn't even do anything sketchy with the design. You didn't do anything sketchy with you have the raw data, and you could just slice and dice that in 100 different ways and extract results from it. You know, I remember taking Daniel Lakin's, I don't know if you know him. He's like a
Daniel,
right? So he had this online course. I think you have to pay for it now. I don't know. I took it.
Really? Okay.
And he had this simulation you could run to see, like, with optional stopping height. I think it was optional stopping. How quickly you could get the p-value to pop under 0.05 if you just kept checking. And it was just like trivially easy. And it was just remarkable. And so the point is, what I think you're emphasizing here is that all of this research you're looking at, or most of the research, was conducted at a time where researchers had every opportunity to, whether, and it didn't have to be conscious or intentional. It could be
Of
poor
course.
training.
Yeah, yeah.
It could be malicious, but it's usually poor training,
Doesn't have to be. Yeah.
negligence, or and even with that, what you would expect is inflated positive findings, and they're still not finding it instead of that. It's like basically giving people 500 opportunities to cheat and distort things to get the results they want, and you're still not getting them in spite of
Yes.
it. And that
Yes.
that really is a testament to, supposing this is the case, of just how bad the data actually is.
Yeah, I think this is a discovery that or an observation, I suppose I should call it, that we haven't talked enough about in the field, right? Because this goes for all the research, by the way. It's not just the empathy research and psychopathy research. Most, like the vast majority of all the research was produced during this period, right? And still the amount of null findings in the entire research domain is just staggering. And so it really raises a lot of questions, I think. What are we even investigating here, right? Like all these claims that we make, they just don't ping out, and then haven't pinged out even under the most formidable, flexible conditions, right? Yeah.
So, question about that: why did they keep doing it, and how did they keep getting funding?
That's a good question. I mean, obviously, I cannot say for sure because it's not something we have investigated in depth, I think. But you have to remember that in the 1990s, there was a huge focus on psychopathy. It was part of the conversation, the Get Tough on Crime movement in the 1990s. Of course, the Get Tough on Crime was a movement in the 1980s that went into the 1990s. But I think that's one of the reasons why we might have seen an influx in funding in forensic psychology and criminology in general. So of course, if you have an idea that seems to promise all these things, I can just see how it would be easy to get funding for it, right? Now you do raise. There's another level to your question. Why did people keep doing this when it was all null findings? um, at some point, people would have realized that, oh, this is just nulls. What's going on here, right? Now, this I think is a little bit more interesting because what we found in our analysis of this research is that, first of all, we were the first to do a systematic review of this type of research, of the empathy. So you had to go all the way to 2024 before systematic review came out, which is just interesting. This is usually not the case in a psychology field, right? Like they tend to come pretty fast after there's some research, right? But that didn't come here. So people might have thought that there was a lot of really interesting findings when in fact there wasn't, right? And what we also found across these studies, so there is roughly, I think it's 36 cognitive empathy studies. There's 30 something affective empathy studies, but the cognitive empathy and the affective empathy studies, so 66 studies in total, I believe. There's a lot of shenanigans going on in how effects are described, right? So you will find studies where they write in the abstract as if they found something really profound, as if they corroborated this theory, but when you go and look at the results section, they did no such thing.
I'm very familiar with this.
What's that?
Like, I'm just so familiar with papers making tall claims in the abstract or the intro. And then you go look at what they actually did. One of the wildest ones, I can't remember what it was, but they had supplemental data that showed basically that all the results were the opposite of what they were claiming.
Yeah.
And it was just like, we were just like looking at this. I was sitting there with a whole like group of people. We're all looking at this like, what on earth happened here? How did this get past peer review? How did nobody notice this? This is wild.
Yeah, this is what people often forget in the whole questionable research practices or false psychology era, is that it was not just questionable research practices or flexibility in analysis that was endorsed, but it was also scientific spin, right? So you were allowed to use spin language when you were portraying or disseminating your papers, right? So it's almost I want to say that it's not all studies, but there's a good chunk of studies where where people are describing their abstract that they found all these effects, but when you go in, you just see that none of them survived, controlling for multiple comparisons, or survive for controlling for confounding variables, such as just like things like IQ or language capabilities or education, like really, really trivial stuff, right? But in the abstract, they describe the weakest of the statistical analysis, but in in the paper, you just see the whole thing falls apart. It's just normal. So maybe there's just been this sense that we were making progress in the
Yeah.
field when and that was driven in part by spin, right? Um, my favorite is that when scientists describe in their methods section that we tested all these variables. So in a motion recognition study, it could be like we tested all these emotions, say 10 emotions, and we correlated them with all these scores on the psychopathy scale and these sub-scores and so on. And then they go to the results section, and then they report results from one emotion correlated with one subscale, right? So you just know they did all these other tests, and they are, non-reported, right? So the paper is basically like, you're panning for gold, right? So
Yep. I've
you're
seen
only
this. I've seen
showing
this
the
multiple
it's
times.
selective reporting, right? And it's just so again, it can generate the illusion of progress when it's not, right? This is a very common phenomenon in psychology.
Well, I wanted to mention something about what you were saying, like they make a claim in the abstract, like some broad analysis, and then you look at the details and like
Yeah,
none of it pans out.
very common.
I notice a tendency in like my area where people will cite the claims that remain in the paper that are kind of spinning the results. Like, here's what we found.
Yeah.
They'll cite that snippet, almost like taking a sound clip of somebody from a YouTube video where they say something controversial out of context or something. They'll take that snippet and they'll quote it in another paper and cite them saying, this is what the paper says. And then if you actually look at the details, the paper doesn't say that.
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't actually, that doesn't withstand scrutiny. And so you see not just the papers themselves getting spun, but then the spin is the only thing that's cited and repeated in subsequent papers.
Yeah.
And then it just goes on and on and on. I remember in one case, people kept citing this paper showing that like hypnosis had this big effect on people's moral judgment or something. And so I was like, oh, come on. So I went and looked up the paper, and it was like they found a positive effect with a tiny sample size. And it was like a very tiny effect, which I wouldn't even have expected from a small sample size.
Yeah.
But it was just like, my first thought was they should have replicated this. This is so marginal and so questionable, but it was just such a minor finding. It almost looked like some dinky pilot study. And I just couldn't understand. Everybody's just citing this as though hypnosis does this. And it just, the one study that everybody was citing, like, didn't really show very much. Yeah. It was just weird. And everybody was citing it. I don't remember the particular paper, but I've seen so much of this of basically lazy citation, where people will just look at the abstract or look at some claim made in the paper and then cite it as though it was established without apparently giving any of the nuance or detail a look at all.
Yeah, this is a very common observation. You see it all over psychopathy research as well, unfortunately, but it's nevertheless what you find. Yeah.
But I feel like we keep getting caught up in so many little eddies of details that are interesting. I want to get to the last two of these things. And then I want to briefly discuss the zombie idea and end on that, if that's all right.
Yeah, good.
I'm about to run out of time. I don't normally go quite as long here. So if we could get through these, so the last two is going to be like, there's this like neurological or biological data that supports this idea of psychopathy. And then the last one, I took a note on it, but I wasn't quite sure. My understanding was that that we have a good sort of theoretical understanding of what's going on here.
Yeah, okay. Those are the two final claims.
Talk about this zombie idea.
I mean, to people still listening, they kind of sense the pattern probably that there are these claims that once we subject them to critical testing empirically, they don't seem to hold up, right? And there's of course also we have alluded to that there's also paired with some shenanigans, that there's some spin going on here, right? Which of course it's kind of implicit when you have claims that have sustained a survival rate despite the evidence actually falsifying it, then of course there's spin going on, right? So this is also what is going on with the neurological research, unfortunately. I should say, I can make this brief. The neurobiological research has taken all sorts of shapes and forms. So in the 1990s, we used EEG, which is measuring brain waves, which is debatable whether that can inform anything about a personality disorder. Today, we don't really think it can, but in the 1990s, people thought it could. But the research that I have paid most attention to, and also the research I've been most involved in, is the MRI research, right? So magnetic resonance imaging, so neuroimaging research, like the best methods we have, the best technology we have, right? And this research is also a pretty prolific domain. We have just around 100 studies in total. So there's actually a pretty good evidence base. This was a research field that proliferated in the very early 2000s. I actually think the first MRI studies from the year 2000. And then it really peaked around 2010, 12, I think, something like that. Maybe a little bit later, a couple of years later, maybe. And then it has kind of like gone down again. People don't do so much research on this. And one of the main reasons is that, again, it's the same story. It's just been null findings, right? The null ratio is a little bit lower than the moral psychological research, which of course is very high. The null ratio in the neurobiological research is hovering around 70 to 80%, which is still very high, of course. But it depends on, how discrete, how controlled the methods are, and so on. But the overall message is there are two overarching messages that people should pay attention to. So these are messages from systematic reviews, by the way. It's not my personal interpretation or anything. So you can pick up any recent systematic review, not any recent review, but any recent systematic review where reviewers are going through all the evidence, right? Not just a subset, because this is a whole other can of worms where reviewers are cherry picking evidence. So if you look at all the research, and there are two very good studies, one study that I participated in myself personally, but also another, but they're both produced by Philip Deming, who's a young neuroscientist, very done some very good work. But they really pretty much just review all the research we have, count all the effects, what is a null finding and what is not, and then shows that there's this high null proportion, right? Now, one thing that we have also found in some separate studies is that none of these effects. So some people say, well, it's not all null findings. There's some significant findings here and there. And the message to that is that, yeah, that might be, but none of this has replicated, right? So one study might find significant effect in this area of the brain, and then when another study comes around, use exactly the same method, replicates the method, then they don't find that effect, right? So what you have is just this sporadic, seemingly random significant findings, and in neuroscience it's not so difficult to explain because there's so many potential confounds that we cannot control for in neuroimaging research. Like, are people on medicine? Do they have a substance misuse, or do they have concussions that we don't know of? There's so many things that can ping out in an MRI scanner, right? So the message is the same: null findings all over, nothing replicated. Pretty much just we don't really have anything to go with here. We have also detected some unfortunate episodes of, again, spin, shenanigans and methods and so on, but still, the message is still the same, right? That we don't really have the evidence base. And just quickly, Lance, to the because now the narrative is getting really obvious, right? with in terms of the theory claim. The message is the same, right? There are two major theories of psychopathy. So by theory, we mean explanations of what is going on, right? So we believe we can explain psychopathy with either that it's a very that it's an affective disorder that impairs a person's ability to feel or to have emotions. Some researchers have gone as far as saying they have no emotions, which I'm not even sure is biologically possible, but let's just say that it's low emotions, right? And another theory is that they have grave impulse control problems. So these are two things that are actually quite easy to measure. So we can do impulse control studies. I don't have to go into the methods we use, but they're quite established methods in psychology. And then we can measure physiological changes in people's emotions, right? We have a fairly good understanding of what goes on in your body when you're feeling something, right? And what we find in these studies is just it's not the case that people who are diagnosed with psychopathy have no emotions or low emotions. We just don't find that. And in terms of impulse control problems, we don't see what we find across studies is usually either very small, weak effects or no effects at all, right? So there's some good meta-analytic work on this also, where the effects we find, if you look at the meta-analytic effects, at best you can say there's like a small effect. But again, if this small impulse control problem should explain this entire personality disorder, it doesn't seem to make much sense, right? It seems like you can just easily explain that with, it's a correctional population. There's probably huge confounding factors with that impairs impulse control, maybe, and concussions and head trauma and so on. But yeah, so it's very underwhelming what has been found in these studies. So overarching narrative here is that all these claims that we make about psychopathy or has been made about psychopathy just hasn't really stand up to testing. That's what we find.
Okay. So we got through all of it. I want to make a couple points about that, and maybe you'll disagree with some of this, but I think you've alluded to something similar. So you mentioned how there's some positive results in some of these cases, and some people might look at mixed results in the data. There's negative data, there's positive data, and go, well, maybe there's a case to be made, but we should lean on the positive results. Of course, often the positive studies are the lower quality studies, but there's a couple things to emphasize that I think are worth mentioning, which is that, setting aside the question of like what the overall body of literature actually says, we can also in some cases, and I'm assuming this has been done outside of my areas like social psychology, is we could look for like direct evidence, and in some cases like there's various types of evidence that you might get, evidence of like publication bias, of p-hacking. I remember looking at a paper where the reported significance tests, like the main significance test for like through the main 3 or 4 studies, it was like a 0.048, a 0.05, 0.047, and like a 0.049 or something like that.
Yeah.
And I actually ran, there's a program like Stat Check or something on it. And actually one of the 0.05s that was reported was like a 0.053 or something. And they must have rounded down, which I don't, that seems like a no-no. Or they just misreported the data. But like all the data suspiciously hovered at or just below 0.05 in a way that just was so obviously like they were doing something suspicious there, or very, very likely. I mean, of course that could happen by chance, but there are like statistical tools. I don't know how good they are for assessing how likely is it, assuming that there's a real effect for you to get these results. And the answers are typically very unlikely. Like, and you can look at like a graph where it's like, if there is a real effect, you should actually frequently get, with like a sample size of a given size, like the p-value should be quite low. You should get like 0.001 and stuff like that. And it's just, it's highly suspicious when people get all these p-values that just happen to just get nudged under the threshold in a way that's just statistically very improbable. So you get stuff like that. But also one thing we didn't mention, and maybe the concern here is maybe getting too into the weeds, but one of the things they found with that attempt at replicating 100 studies in like 3 top journals in psychology, that 2015 paper, which we were discussing, I think, before we were talking here. But in any case, not only did they find in that particular study that I think like 36 or 39, I forget the exact number, of the original studies replicated, that the estimated effect sizes tended to drop quite a lot, like by a huge amount. And so even if there was evidence of an effect, I mean, one thing is you might think, well, maybe we're failing to exclude some of the low quality studies. And so we're getting some false positives that are inflating the sense that there's some real effect. But even setting aside that issue, even when there are apparently real effects, the effects are often so tiny as to have very little practical significance. And in the case, and this is especially relevant in the case of psychopathy, because it'd be very weird to say this group of people, these are the psychopaths, and they're like marginally more likely to have they have 5% more impulse control problems. They're 3% more violent. At that point, that's psychopathy. I mean, that sounds like that seems very weird to, and for some issues in social or personality psychology, small effects can be real and have some degree of significance and can sustain the claim being made to a point. But when it comes to psychopathy, it seems a little weird to say, "Oh, well, we do have data, but the effects are very, very tiny." It seems like
Yeah.
at that point, it's just not supporting the initial claim at all.
Yeah. No, that's exactly what we find, right? And some researchers are fine with that and say, "Oh, this is just what it was," right? I'm not so fine with that. I you know, if you have to, you cannot square the circle, right? Like if you claim that these individuals are extreme and then you find only small effects, well, something has to give, right? Like either you have to adjust your claim that they're actually not that extreme, but then with something like psychopathy, you run into this paradox. Then it's no longer a disorder. Then it's no longer, you're just speaking about like, minor things that does not reach this clinical disorderly level, right? And so it becomes like, I think it runs deep, and I think eventually just kind of like, this is where we're moving, of course, that I think at some point you have to ask yourself whether all of this is actually undermining the very idea itself, right? Um,
Yeah, so why don't you tell us about this idea of like zombie ideas and how maybe psychopathy is a candidate for that? And I guess that we could wrap up on there. There's a couple of things I wanted to ask about. So if I
yeah,
feel
go
like
for
we
it.
have time and you're up for it, then we could do that. Should I do that
Um,
before or after we get into the zombie idea?
what question did you want to ask, you say?
Oh, so here's what I was really curious about when you brought up the data in the US is it started making me think about two things, which is how like psychopathy diagnostically and just more generally how it's treated on an international scale. Because I would imagine that I don't even know if every country uses the same diagnostic standards. Like,
Yeah.
does everybody use the DSM? Like, if you had to ask me, I'd say probably most of them. I don't know. I'm not a clinician. But then also there's going to be like different cultural perspectives on the manifestation, especially in like in indigenous populations that wouldn't be participating as much or at all in
Mm.
like active scientific research. And also like you mentioned, this idea was proposed in like the 1700s. I know, for a lot of things that are totally legitimate and well-established mental illnesses, they may not have been mentioned until recently. I mean, it took
Mm.
a weirdly long time for psychology to emerge as its own discipline.
Mm.
But like, so both like how this is handled from like a legal and therapeutic perspective across cultures today, and then also I guess these are two different questions. Like, are there historical indications? Like, it wouldn't surprise me to find out like Cicero had once said there is a certain class of man that is morally deranged. Like, there could have been some ancient historical evidence of like psychopaths emerging, but if there is, I've never heard of anything like that. So I guess those are my two
Yeah.
questions. How is this handled on an international scale, and is there any deeper historical evidence, like historical or anthropological evidence, that this is a sort of thing that's emerging outside
Yeah.
a particular cultural context?
Let me take them in reverse order, because
Okay.
the last question, whether there's any like deeper historical evidence of people recognizing something like psychopathy, the answer is kind of. So a lot of psychopathy researchers, or I shouldn't say a lot, but there's a handful of psychopathy researchers that always love to talk about how there are some cases in the Bible, and there's like here and there
Mm.
where and there's some indigenous peoples have narratives about there's all sorts of like stories. I tend to not pay too much attention to this because I'm pretty allergic to data that is not too stable. So like if you have some statement from a ancient Greek historian that makes something in passing in some scroll that he wrote down 3,000 years ago, I'm not so sure what we can say about that, right? But yeah, there's plenty of evidence from ancient texts that there are individuals who are more nasty than other people, right? They don't operate with the concept of personality disorders back then, right? So yeah, there's some evidence that this is something people have been addressing. I don't think it's serious evidence. I don't know what to do with it. That's my take on it. Now, in terms of the global uptake of the psychopathy diagnosis, it's something that is actually developing quite quickly. And I'm not going to make this too long, but overall, Psychopathy is a diagnosis that it was initially included, not by name, in the DSM, when the DSM 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 now in the fifth edition. It has always figured in some way or the other in these manuals, and most profoundly from DSM-3. It goes under the name of antisocial personality disorder, where psychopathy is by some researchers, or I should say most researchers, either seen as a synonym for antisocial personality disorder or a subtype of antisocial personality disorder, right? So you can, in practice, you can diagnose psychopathy more like in a clinically strict sense by giving, what you would do is that you give a person antisocial personality disorder with psychopathic specifiers. That would be the clinical nomenclature, if you will. Now, something interesting has happened with personality disorders recently, namely is that the ICD-11, the International Classification of Diseases, which is the World Health Organization's diagnostic manual, they have gotten rid of distinct categories of personality disorders. So psychopathic personality disorder is no longer a distinct category. So they just have personality disorder, and then there's different symptoms you can have. So there's something developing there. Now, that's the clinical side of things. So when we turn to the forensic side of things, there's not good research on how the psychopathy diagnosis influences legal decisions, other than in North America. We have some evidence here and there from different countries, but there's not a lot of it. So it's really not something I can like give you some clean-cut data on. But just anecdotally, we do know that people across the world, they do assess for psychopathy. We know that because we sometimes survey practitioners and say, hey, what do you do when you make risk assessments? And then you can ask people in Asia and South America, Australia, and so on. And people do highlight that they do assess for psychopathy. Now, we don't have any like profound, deeper studies into how this diagnosis makes its way into legal decision making, unfortunately. So the vast majority has been Canada and US focused of the studies. Yeah. So I'm a little bit uncomfortable speaking a little bit beyond that because our data is
Gotcha.
really not that good. So, but I have a lot of anecdotal evidence, and I know I know that the assessment tools have all been translated into different languages, which is also another indication that is being used, right? So, but
Mhm.
it's hard for me to say exactly how. I wouldn't be surprised if it's exactly in the same ways as being used in North America. So, yeah.
Okay, so we're winding down here to this idea, this zombie idea, and this is what caught me about the article. I was like, I like this idea because in my own work, I think that there's a couple zombie ideas floating around in both psychology and philosophy, and that stuck out to me. And I was like,
Yeah.
this is cool. So, what's this idea of a zombie idea, and why might psychopathy be a zombie idea?
Yeah, so a zombie idea is this concept we use to describe ideas. It could be theories, or it could just be like an overall perspective. But so we use the term idea to really just describe anything, but it's anything that flourishes in the sciences. Usually we talk about the sciences, where you have either no evidence to believe in that, or that you have evidence to suggest that you shouldn't believe in that. So the zombie metaphor here is that the idea is dead. It has been falsified, it has been killed, but it walks around in academic circles and manages to infect, so bite, like a zombie bite scientist, and then they believe in this idea, right? So something like that, right? Zombie ideas in the sciences are rare. Fortunately, they're rare because this is exactly science. You know, in an ideal way, science should be immune to zombie ideas. But obviously, we know that it's not because we have many historical examples of zombie ideas, right? And one there, I could give you a couple of examples if we had time for that. But one clear example would be something like race theory. This idea from biology that the human species is divided into different discrete races, like there's white, Asian, black, and so on, right? And that idea was assumed to just be true for perhaps around a century or something like that. by scientists. And so when we reached like the 50s, 60s, and discovery of DNA and so on, we started to realize that that doesn't really make much sense. That our species is divided into these, or categorized into these very few groups, right? Now, something interesting happened when the empirical research kind of killed off that idea. Because the idea is intuitively appealing, right? So, in a trivial sense, like if you look out at the world, let's just like look from the vantage point of say a British biologist in the 1800s, right? Looking out at the world population, he might have been biased in the way of just seeing, oh, there seems to be 5 groups of people or something like that, right? So the idea is like there's an intuition that kind of follows, but once the scientific evidence becomes like detailed and powerful enough, it kind of kills off that intuition. It's also like intuitive to think the world is flat, the globe is flat, but once the evidence accumulates, you kind of kills off that idea, right? But anyway, what happens with zombie ideas is that the intuition wins over the evidence. It's like the evidence and the intuition like bumps heads, right? But the loser is the evidence, and the idea still survives, right? So what happened with race theory, biological race theory, was that people still continue doing research on it, and there still are people today who refuse to believe DNA and genetics evidence and so on, right? And just like they just continue doing research on the very few individuals. They're still around, but in the 60s and 70s and 80s and so on, there was very smart people who just kept doing study on this, and stubbornly refused to give up on the idea, right? So this would be like an example of a zombie idea, something that is intuitively appealing, has a lot of traction for all sorts of reasons. It can be with race theory, is probably something with political ideological convictions, like you wanted this to be true, so you kind of believed in it, right? Because of racist ideologies, maybe. With other zombie ideas, it can just be other reasons, like it could be cultural biases and so on, right? So my claim here is that maybe psychopathy. So it's a claim. I wouldn't call this a claim, but it's a way I'm starting to think more carefully that perhaps psychopathy is one such zombie idea. When we look out in the world, a lot of people have the intuition when they see people do really nasty things, and they do them without feeling much remorse, maybe, or not showing remorse, or not showing empathy. It's very intuitively appealing to think there's something wrong with them, right? That there must be something completely off the chart, psychologically, clinically abnormal, disorderly about them. But once we start to test this idea, the evidence just doesn't support that, right? So here we have a potential setup for a zombie idea, right? So I can also talk to my personal experiences, how powerful this idea is. I can teach a full semester course on psychopathy and go through all the research, and there are still students who are just not convinced. They still want to keep the idea. So they have seen all the empirical evidence. They've seen that all these claims that they associate with the concept does not have any traction in the empirical record. They still refuse to give up on it. And these are not clinicians, so they don't have like any clinical background to have this idea be powerful to them. They have just seen television shows, movies, read books. That's all it takes, and they're still not convinced, right? Now, imagine to be a clinician who has seen individuals who are so that's supposed to be an even stronger intuition, right?
Yeah.
And yeah. So this is how I'm thinking about it, and maybe this is another zombie idea that is like currently in front of us. So it's a very rare case that we can identify zombie ideas in real time. It's usually something we discover in hindsight, right? That, oh, this was a zombie idea, right? So yeah.
Yeah, I do wonder whether ideas can become zombie ideas, and then the zombie can last so long. Like some zombies might endure for decades, but I'm thinking to issues in psychology, like in my area, where ideas became relatively discredited in the literature, but still persisted for some time, and then eventually people kind of abandoned it. And the first one that came to mind for me is like ego depletion, and I
Yeah,
don't know how familiar
yeah,
you are with that, but
yeah,
like the data for that was pretty bad for a while, and people were still dragging on about it, but
yeah,
it just became increasingly marginalized until now. I think it's been a few years where uh, I think most people have accepted, yeah, there was nothing there.
yeah.
There's probably a couple people like hanging on to it. Probably a couple of those.
I'm pretty sure there is. I just saw a recent study, for example. So
Okay. Well, but like that's an idea that I think is, it never had any grounding anyway. I remember seeing a paper looking at how like the proposed physiological mechanism, like with decreased blood glucose, just made no sense from a physiological perspective. It was just totally
so,
not
but you see,
viable.
Lance, you know what they say about psychological theories and ideas, that they don't die. They,
Mm.
like Paul Mills said, they go like old generals. They just fade away.
Hmm.
They just like, it's not like we say, oh, ego depletion, let's all psychologists get together and then announce this idea dead. That's not actually what is going on. People just like abandon it quietly, and then it just fades, right? And this is also, and this is a line of evidence that I don't think I speak about in my article, or but it's something that I'm currently working on a project. An interesting pattern you find in psychopathy research, by the way, is that you see this enormous explosion in research interest in the 1990s, and the different subfields, they are a little bit delayed from each other because of technology. I think I mentioned that, right? But you see a massive explosion, and then you see a stagnation, and then what you see afterwards is a nosedive decline in research interest. That is all the subfields. So again, it's a study. I'm working on a mapping review right now, but it's all what I've seen. Initial data is that this is what we find across all the subfields, right? So this would be evidence to suggest that researchers are like dropping this
Yeah.
research really quickly, right? And that would be like a good indication that maybe people see it as such. Well, of course, the people who abandon it have now, like, they acknowledge that it's falsified. So to them, it's not a zombie idea, right? But to the people who like, it's still being taught in university courses, it's still being assessed in clinical settings, it's still being talked about at conferences as if this is a real thing, and so on, right? So the zombie element is still there, right?
Yeah, what seems to be sustaining it is like both the pop culture element and the clinical element of it. I think,
For sure, yeah,
or
yeah.
as this isn't the case for a lot of other ideas like ego depletion. There's just no, well, and now we're seeing a lot of the nudge research go by the wayside as well. So that I guess ideas in so it seems to me like in social psychology, the fads are fast, like they're shorter lifespan, kind of like a big star, like they burn bright
Yeah,
and they die out a lot quicker.
for
And this
sure.
one's
Yeah,
just
that's a
had
good
more
analogy.
endurance.
Yeah, yeah, that's, or metaphor. Yeah, it burns very bright, and it seems like a lot of people want jumps on board, want a piece of the cake. They want some of the funding that follows with the hype and all that, right? It's which, by the way, in hot fields, as John Ioannidis pointed out in his famous 2005 paper, it's like when you have hot fields, like fields that really quickly become prolific and have a lot of like studies. When some of these studies report significant results, there's going to be a higher likelihood that they are false positives, and that's
Yeah,
because
well, we saw that with the COVID research. I mean, there
yeah,
was so
yeah,
much
yeah, yeah,
garbage published.
yeah, yeah. And that's what happens, right? Because there's so much research being done, but you're only seeing the tip of the iceberg, and the rest is being, you know, put in the drawer because it was all nulls, right? So you're
Yep.
just seeing, you might just be seeing the false positives, right? That makes it through. Or there's a higher likelihood that what you're looking at is false positives, right? So again, we have talked about that this research was done during a false positive psychology, questionable research practice era, but it was also done under hype and hotness, right? So you have all these things that are like really speaking against this whole understanding, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much more we could say about that, but I do feel like we should probably wrap it up at this point. So before we do that, I wanted to ask if you had a book to plug. Like, I'm going to put your article in the description, but I could put like an Amazon link to your book or something. I don't know. Whatever.
Yeah, sure. I mean, my book is out. It's actually here, standing here nicely in the back, which is Psychopathy Unmasked. It's probably going to be reversed to the people. Psychopathy Unmasked: The Rise and Fall of Dangerous Diagnosis. Yeah, if readers want to check it out, they can probably get it through their local library or wherever books are sold. And
Cool.
yeah, it's I pretty much summarize, of course, in detail what we have been talking about in this conversation here. So one thing that I would encourage maybe listeners to think about, if I haven't convinced them, which I'm sure there's a lot of people I haven't convinced out there, is that we're not denying that there are not nasty people out there, or I'm not denying, or people who are skeptical about psychopathy, they're not denying that there are nasty people out there. We are saying that we are misunderstanding that phenomenon, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not driven by a personality disorder. It's driven by all sorts of things, right? And there's a whole other conversation behind that also. But this idea of psychopathy is kind of distorting that, our perspectives. And the final thing to say is that to people who are very critical about this, I would just point out this would not be the first time in the history of psychiatry that we have faced a zombie idea, right? The most recent example might be multiple personality disorder, where people thought that there was this phenomenon of people with multiple personalities. Turns out that that was not the case, right? But for 2-3 decades, people were fascinated about this idea, and they studied it wildly and wrote many books about it. And then it just turned out to be a fad, right? So there are many similarities here. This is not unique. In other words, what I'm saying about psychopathy is not historically unique in any way.
All right. Well, thanks very much. We'll leave it there. So everybody that's watching this, if you made it all the way to the end, do please like the video, subscribe, check out the links in the description, and all that good stuff. And we'll leave it there. Thanks again for being here.
Thanks for having me, Lance.
All right.